Hello and welcome to Man with the Movie podcast, where we'll be talking about all the strange and sometimes scary films that most other podcasts don't talk about. My name is Daniel, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Linas.
And today we will be talking about a very interesting film. Why don't you introduce that for us, Linus?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about Cemetery Man, which is also known by its, I think, much better name, Dellamorte. It's a horror film from Italy, made in the 90s, which is sort of slightly peculiar in its own right, because by the 90s, Italian horror had kind of reached almost the peak of its decline, like nobody was making giallos anymore. But this film was made in the 90s, and it's a very peculiar film. And I know that you recently got a chance to actually see it on the big screen, which is why I thought it would be an interesting topic for the podcast.
Well, yes, I knew it was a big favorite of yours prior to me watching it, or even before it was really on my radar. I know you particularly loved it, and I think I've heard a little bit about it, but I didn't really know anything about it. I'll be honest, I guess I should be pretty upfront. I'm not a big horror person, like at all. I do have, I guess there's always exceptions. I just don't exactly respond as much to the genre as a lot of other people do, especially films that I find very sadistic, that don't really treat their characters like humans, that they're more just like cattle or fodder.
Yeah.
So I've never responded so well to horror in general. I've seen, I guess we'll talk about Italian horror, the history. So yes, this sort of film is really not within the types of films I normally seek out. But, I mean, it did look kind of strange. It did look like something that, it would be very interesting to see on the big screen. So, yes, I did. I noticed that there was a 4K restoration recently. So it did play in some theaters around me, but like once, this was not the first screening of this film. This was the second. The first one, they were doing a double feature with Stage Fright, the other Soavi film I've heard about.
It's also a film I really like
that film. Yeah. I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts about that. But I couldn't make that screening, and so I was a little, I was like, oh well, won't catch this until they added another showing of Cemetery Man. But this time they added a Q&A with one of the actresses from the film, not the main lead actress, but with Fabiana Formica, who plays Valentina. Basically, she's the girl that Gnaghi pukes on and then falls in love with. So, yeah. I think it was her prompting my local theater to host the screening. And this is not like, I live near LA. LA has lots of cool screenings, but this is not like a theater in LA. This is a theater in the county outside of LA, which was very unusual that they get more high profile people to show up for things like this. So that was pretty cool. The screening was really interesting. I have quite a few thoughts about the movie, which we'll get into, but I guess the experience of it was cool, and the Q&A itself was pretty interesting. Fabiana said quite a bit about her experience with the film, and I think the most interesting thing from that was that she didn't know what was going on in the movie. Like, she was told very little by the director about what her role in this movie is and what would happen to her. So it was just a big surprise. I think even she said the puking on her was a big surprise too. That made me wonder, like, I guess, as a director yourself, do you keep your actors or actresses ever like in a state of not knowing what will happen to them, just to maybe get more of a genuine reaction, or do you always let them know or read the full script?
Very rarely. I haven't done that too much, but I've seen that happen on films that I worked on. Like, I remember one time the character had to sort of act out surprise in a scene where I was working as a spark. Like, shock, it was a horror film, and the director, sort of unbeknownst to the actor, like, threw something behind them, so they got like a genuine jump scare from the noise while acting out the scene. But I've heard also of like stories of people doing that, like even some quite funny ones. Like for instance, there's one really famous one from The Shining. So the kid, he was 6 years old, I want to say, or maybe even younger when he was acting in The Shining. Like the main kid, I can't remember the character's name. I think Danny, I want to say. Might be wrong there.
Danny.
Yeah, but he obviously couldn't know that it's like this awful horror film. So what they told him, that they were shooting I want to say a rom-com between Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. And he like grew up basically with that lie, and only like learned what the film was actually about like 18 years later, something mental like that.
That's amazing. I don't know how he could have been. I mean, because he was there in some of those scenes where
Oh yeah.
Jack Nicholson murders people and like is running around with an axe. Like that's a difficult sell for a kid to really believe it's a rom-com.
Yeah,
Maybe there's some rom-coms like that out there.
The classic rom-com special of just murdering some people.
Yeah, it happens. But yeah, it's a very interesting technique, I suppose. One that maybe has some ethical questions. I know in A Taste of Cherry, the Kiarostami film, the director was sitting in the car and would do things to the actors in the car to get their reactions. I think one would involve like pulling out a gun on them to make them like fear or something.
Jesus.
Anyways, it's very interesting. Yeah, it's interesting, especially for a director known for his humanism, to do things like that. So, yeah.
Anyways, I guess on that point, I actually remember like Sidney Lumet in his book Making Movies actually talking about that, where he also like described various ways he would go about getting performances out of them. And I remember he had a passage where he spoke about how very like early on in his career, I think it might have been right after 12 Angry Men, or maybe when he was still working in television, where he just couldn't get a performance out of this actress, and basically just had to like resolve to like physically slapping her across the face, like right before he said roll the cameras. And he said after that, even though the performance that he got from the actress was brilliant, like actual shock and real tears, he felt so terrible afterwards that he said after that instance, I'll never do that again in my career. And he said if I can't achieve the performance I want through pure craft, and like to hell with it.
Yeah, a lot of ethical lines being broached here, but so I think at least with bringing it back to Fabiana Formica's experience, it didn't seem like anything all that traumatizing was happening to her. The vomit, I think it was more entertaining, and apparently she said it was yogurt was in the vomit. So, yeah. Anyways, why don't we talk a bit about the context of Cemetery Man? You were mentioning how this occurred at a pretty dismal point in Italian horror history, where the whole genre had been dying or dead. So, how did the genre even get to that point to begin with? I think knowing about the genre is actually quite important to knowing and appreciating the film itself.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about Michele Soavi, the director of this film, is that he was basically considered Dario Argento's protege. And Dario Argento is obviously, for people who don't know, the most famous Italian horror director who got his sort of big break in the 60s when Italian horror genre called giallos really blew up. And Soavi, during that time, I believe he worked on some of those films as an assistant director, maybe doing some other thing. And then later on, Argento helped him find some financing in the 80s and 90s and basically allowed Soavi to make his own films. But by the 90s, the giallo genre was basically completely dead. Like I said, it kind of got its start in the 60s. It was still pretty big in the 70s, but like all of like sort of the big Italian genres and movements like spaghetti westerns, polizioteschi, giallos, even post post-neorealism of Fellini and Antonioni, like by the 70s and 80s in particular, it really like sort of began to wither away and die, and there wasn't really anything new coming in by that point in time. So by the 90s, the state of Italian horror was really dismal in particular. Like there wasn't really anyone making horror films anymore.
Here's a quick pop quiz for you. What does the word giallo mean in Italian?
I believe it's yellow.
Yes. And do you happen to know why?
Yeah, so giallos were mostly based on these murder mystery books, like cheap murder mystery books, and they used to have yellow covers. And a lot of them like either like took inspiration from them or adaptation of those cheap giallo books with yellow covers.
Yeah, you stole my little bit of trivia, so well done. Yeah, so this was, I guess, originally started as a novel genre. I guess these were books that originally were even translations of English stories, and then they just became a whole Italian horror industry. And then they made their way through film with films like Blood and Black Lace, and then Argento's debut, The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which was one of the very first like really stylish modern thrillers. A lot of these started to push the envelope a lot more in terms of the content, in terms of the sexuality, in terms of the violence. So this really had its peak in the 70s with directors like Argento and Fulci and Mario Bava, and then they really ran out of steam once. Kind of a lot of reasons, but one was they didn't really have as much to say. This is kind of a reoccurring thing as I saw through Italian horror. It kind of fractured into all these different subgenres. There's this Italian word called filone, which is somewhat means like a genre, but it's also more like their variations, I guess. But anyways, yeah, the genre itself kind of exhausted itself, and then this kind of paved the way for other films. There were also zombie films that were happening, which which will eventually lead to Cemetery Man. But there were zombie films maybe around the 80s, I would say. Once Dawn of the Dead came out in America, which was I think 1978. That was a big influence on the Italian horror industry. I think they saw the big box office returns of that film, and they tried to capitalize on it. They made their own sequel. That film was actually called Zombie in Italy, Zombi, I believe. And then they made an unofficial sequel called Zombie Flesh Eaters. And then guys like Fulci and Lenzi took their hand at making a zombie film. And a lot of these were, they kind of similar to their giallo work, which were, they had a lot of gross out gore. They had a lot of elaborate death scenes. I haven't actually seen most of these, but it's just what I know. A lot of these were about very specific themes like nuclear power or religion or immigration. They had ideas behind them. They weren't just like, I don't know, shallow violence and sex. But they also eventually ran out of steam like giallo did. They lacked budgets, they lacked special effects, and they lacked new ideas. So it's kind of Italian horror as a whole died in the late 80s, it seems like. Yeah. 'Cause they couldn't just keep up with America. So, yeah. And came Michele Soavi, as Linus was mentioning. So I know you've seen some other Soavi films, I guess. What's your experience with the director? This was the only one of his films I've seen, so I'm interested to know about some of his others.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about him is that his very first film was a documentary on Dario Argento. It's called Dario Argento's World of Horror, that he made in 1984, 85, somewhere around that time, and obviously he sort of collaborated with Argento on that. But a couple years later, he made his first narrative film, which is a film called Stage Fright, which also happens to be like my all-time favorite slasher film and one of my favorite horror films ever, alongside Cemetery Man or Dellamorte. It's a lot simpler than this one. Like Dellamorte, as we'll discuss, is like a really crazy film that doesn't fit any kind of box, whereas Stage Fright is very, very much rooted in the giallo tradition and very firmly a slasher film. But I find it very creative, very fun, and it has a lot of like interesting ideas that I really like. Like I think what really stuck out in my mind, like from the very start of the film, is the opening, where you effectively see you see a woman sort of smoking in an alleyway, and then a serial killer jumps out with a massive owl masks and murders the woman. But he like, as he jumps out, he like does a salto and does like a full-on dance to some jazz music as he stabs her, and then the camera pulls out and you realize, oh, this is actually a rehearsal for a theater play. And the entire film takes place in this theater, and I just thought, oh, that's also like a really, really cool location for a horror film, and I really like how it utilized all the different areas of theater, like the costume rooms, the rafters, all of that stuff. So super interesting film. After Stage Fright, Soavi made 2 more films before he made Cemetery Man. He made The Church and The Sect. Both of those were actually meant to be sequels to the Demons film series, the other really famous Italian horror films. But while he was making The Church, which was meant to be Demons 3, he had some disagreements with the producers, and they kind of parted ways midway through the film. He just ended up making his own film that ended up being not associated with the Demons franchise. And then eventually, after those films in 1994, he did make Cemetery Man, which is the film we're talking about today.
Yeah, I've heard The Church is like a big mess, but it's also really interesting.
Yeah.
And ambitious. So that would be interesting, at least, to check out, maybe for people who, I don't know, have seen other Soavi's films. But yeah, getting to Dellamorte. Why don't we start? There's a lot to talk about with this film.
Oh, yes.
Why don't we start with the title? I think that's the very first thing you know about this movie. So the translation, as far as I know, means of death and of love.
Yeah, there's a couple different possible translations. Like I've heard till death, till love, of death, of love, or death of love as well. Like apparently all of those are possible translations for the title. As you may have noticed, none of those translate to Cemetery Man. That's actually something that that Americans gave to the film when it made its way over to America. And they just thought, for some reason, that Cemetery Man sounded cooler than Dellamorte, and they decided to market it using that name. But yeah, the name Dellamorte actually comes from a comic book. A single sort of standalone story, also called Dellamore. But interestingly enough, this comic book was an adaptation of another comic book called Dylan Dog. And Dylan Dog was massively popular in Italy. Not a lot of people over in the English-speaking world know of Dylan Dog, but in the 80s in particular, Dylan Dog was a massive deal in Italy. And what's interesting about Dylan Dog is that the story is centered around this detective, Dylan Dog. And Dylan Dog was actually modeled after the actor Rupert Everett, I think is how you pronounce his surname. And Rupert Everett actually plays the main character in Cemetery Man, or Dellamore. So it's just like really weird full circle moment where it inspired this comic book character, which then inspired a different comic book, which then inspired this film. All of those were written by the same guy, by the way. And now the guy who was the original inspiration is playing the main character in the film.
Kind of come full circle in a way. That's interesting. Yeah, the whole adaptation of Dylan Dog thing is something I wasn't really familiar with. They do apparently share quite a bit in common. So, yeah, I guess I'd be somewhat interested to know how much of this was original to the movie and how much of the film, I guess, came as like inspiration or adaptation.
The interesting thing about it is, the guy who obviously wrote, I can't remember his name. I had it written down. I forgot the writer, but when he wrote Dylan Dog. He didn't just obviously base it on Rupert Everett, but he actually based it quite a bit on American media as a whole. So like the first issue of Dylan Dog is basically just a take on Night of the Living Dead. Like it's a sort of like a rewrite of Night of the Living Dead in the form of this comic book featuring Dylan Dog essentially. And throughout the comics book, they make a lot of other references to film. But Dylan Dog, essentially the character there, is a detective. He works in Scotland Yard and he deals with various cases that deal with like these monsters, effectively. Whereas Dellamore is super similar to Dylan Dog. Like the character looks very almost identical. The only difference is that Dylan Dog wears a red shirt, whereas Dellamore, main character Francesco Dellamorte, wears a white shirt. And there's a slight difference in their hobbies and interests, but there's also a lot of overlap. Like they're both pretty like depressed, eccentric personalities. Sort of big on nihilism. Like a big overlap between them is both of them have these like strange quirks. Like for instance, Dylan Dog he plays the clarinet, but he only ever plays the devil's trills with the clarinet. Whereas Francesco Dellamorte reads, but all he reads is a telephone book, which is like super strange because whoever reads the telephone book, and that's like the only thing he reads, and he does it all the time. They only ever wear a single outfit, and they're both hopeless romantics, effectively. But the actual story of the film, even though it was an adaptation of Dellamore, the actual film is very different from the standalone comic book. And the writer in the audio commentary for the film, he spoke about his process of writing it, and he said he had quite a few difficulties actually adapting the story for the screen, and he basically ended up having to rewrite the whole story and change a bunch of things just to make it fit a movie.
Yeah, although if I had to choose between watching someone read a telephone book or hearing those clarinet trills, I might take the phone book, but yeah, that's quite interesting. I guess my reason for the question is the film feels uniquely suited to be a film in a sense, in a way that I find a lot of the things that happen in the film, at least maybe it is part adaptation, but I do think a lot of it makes a lot of sense that these were unique cinematic elements and unique cinematic ideas. So, yeah, I guess you've talked about, the nihilism of the film and the main character.
Yeah.
And I think that's the key theme for me, at least, to kind of understanding more about this film. I wouldn't say understand it completely. I don't know if anyone fully understands it, but I do think this is a film that, as we were talking about, it was made at a point of a dead genre. It's a film, I think, that has perhaps some meaning relative to the time and place the genre was made in. I think perhaps audiences and filmmakers were all tired of zombie movies at this point. And so, as the main character is, like, the very first scene, which sets the tone really well, although it was a little misleading too. But he's on the phone, and then the zombie walks into his house, and then he casually puts down the phone, shoots the zombie in the head, and then walks back to the phone to resume his conversation. Which, it was hilarious. It also made me think this would be like a bit of a Shaun of the Dead or Evil Dead 2 sort of experience, which it isn't. It swerves definitely from those kind of molds pretty quickly. But at the same time, it kind of sets the stage of this is a guy who's even just bored of killing zombies. He's just like, this is a common thing. What else can I really do with my life? And I think that's the question of the whole movie.
Yeah, for sure. I think the movie, as you mentioned, really is entirely centered around Francesco Dellamorte, to the point where it is almost like a modernist film in a sense that it's told in this stream of consciousness style. Now, technically, that's a technique exclusive to literature, but in film, you do get films that almost mimic that style. So a film like, for instance, Bergman's Persona where it's also told through a point of view of a single character, to the point where certain things that sort of break the laws of reality makes sense, in the sense that it's all happening inside the character's mind. Like the whole film takes place in their head, essentially. And that's the case here as well. Everything is told from Francesco's point of view, and it's told from this subjective perspective, where things like zombies coming back to life and other really wacky things, particularly towards the end of the film, occur that sort of break the laws of reality. And a good example of that is actually the love interest of Francesco Dellamorte. So it was something that the writer, I did look up his name, it's Tiziano Sclavi, and Soavi talked about in the audio commentary, which is that the reason all of his love interests look alike is not that they're all the same person that just keeps coming back to life mysteriously. It's that Francesco actually sees all women that he has an interest in as the same exact person. So it was their way of sort of showing his sort of misogynistic attitudes towards the women, particularly women he likes. And the whole film sort of mimics that technique in various other ways, because it's all sort of centered around this Francesco character who's very nihilistic, very depressed, very strange, and it all centers around effectively what the title says, death and love.
I think there's also another reason they were all played by that same actress, Anna Falchi, and I think it's because they wanted to give her as much screen time as possible.
Oh, yeah.
Well, this film definitely is not betraying its genre. It, at its core, is a zombie movie and has a lot of those same, you could call them tropes, same things that an audience might expect. It's a bit sleazy. There's quite a lot of nudity. It definitely doesn't hide that. It's pretty upfront with that. So it kind of knows its audience pretty well, but then it also throws a lot, I guess, that to an unsuspecting person like myself, even, who didn't even expect where this film was going or what sort of things it had up its sleeve. So it's like an interesting fusion to me of like a genre movie, but also this kind of existential revisionist end of life sort of take on what that film is. So yeah, again, it's, to me, my initial takeaway was like, this was 3 movies kind of shoved together. But in a way, at least the more time I've let it sit with me, I think it does all work in a sense. There's still things I haven't made sense of, but it's definitely, as I'd agree as how you describe it, as this modernist film, especially within this genre and operating within things and using tropes in ways that other films would, but also subverting expectations pretty significantly at various points in the movie.
Yeah, I'd say that subversion is actually like a big part of the film, because it takes tropes from a lot of things. Like, it obviously takes tropes from other movies, particularly zombie movies. Like, the writer was familiar with Night of the Living Dead, and you can see that that influence on the film as well. But it also takes various elements from fairy tales. Like, there's fairy tales motifs in the film. At one point in time, there's like a Red Riding Hood reference and other references throughout the film. But also, it definitely plays a lot on classic 19th and 20th century existentialism, but also it plays on the Romanticism movement, and particularly the Gothic, where it has taken a lot of those elements, particularly how the Gothic would also mix the idea of death and love, and in particular how it would romanticize death and kind of plays them up. In particular, I really liked what I think was a reference when the Anna Falchi character is having sex with Rupert Everett on top of her dead husband's grave. And I thought that's like a reference to how Mary Shelley famously lost her virginity on top of her mother's grave, and she was obviously part of that also Romanticism and Gothic movements back in the day.
That's an interesting connection. I think, like, I'd have to think about this, but yeah, I think with like the original Frankenstein, that's also a film that even though it was made and written well before the ideas of existentialism and nihilism were really fully explored in literature, there are a lot of some of those currents. You could kind of trace it even back to the original Frankenstein novel, where it captures kind of the true kind of sadness of the monster and kind of the consequences of science and whatnot. I think it's ultimately pretty different than Cemetery Man, but it's interesting to like, I guess, think how far this genre goes back, and where things like, I mean, Frankenstein had huge sort of ripple effects throughout film and literature since the beginning of like the silent era and even till today. So, and they all kind of play on each other in a sense. And I think Cemetery Man is definitely several degrees removed from Frankenstein, but there are interesting connections you could make for sure.
Yeah, I'd say the film pulls various ideas from a lot of stuff, but it can't really like totally be compared to any of the stuff that it sort of references. Like for me, the film doesn't entirely fit into any box that you could place it in. Like it's a very, very strange film. It doesn't really have a story structure. It has a lot of like these philosophical, existential ideas about death and about love and about how those two interact, but they all don't necessarily go anywhere. They just kind of exist, and the characters riff on them and make jokes about them. And the film is really funny, but it doesn't necessarily have like a narrative form, a narrative structure. Like in a sense, it's just a lot of stuff happening in the film, and it's all really just like almost like a character exploration of Francesco Dellamorte, and in particular something that Soavi and Sclavi mentioned a lot in the audio commentary is that Francesco is obviously quite a depressed character. He's a very nihilistic character, and it's a look of into that in particular.
Yeah, it's interesting how you phrase it as like having no structure. I guess I'd be hesitant to say it has no structure, but I get what you mean in saying that it really just feels like things are just happening without kind of a sense of rhyme or reason at a point.
Yeah.
I think it is confusing at first. I do think there are underlying ideas that bind it together in a sense. So I don't really mind that's more the structure than like logical plot, you know. So you know, there are definitely these types of films that are not bounded by like logic, that are bounded more by ideas, and I find those pretty interesting because it's also liberating in a sense, because you know, films that are just bounded by logic obviously means that like, you know, they're a lot more predictable. You know where things are going. You've seen this type of film before usually. But a film like this, where it's really about a character exploration, about existentialism in multiple ways, that it's like, where's it going? You honestly, the first time you'll have no idea really, and I did not. So I mean, these types of films are pretty rare, especially within this genre, a genre like this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there was some structure to the film. I guess maybe I definitely overstated by saying, oh, there's no structure whatsoever. I'd say what mostly stands out, it's very... the characters in the film are very reactive. Like a lot of narrative films in particular have proactive characters who have a certain goal that they pursue, because that's the aspect that allows the story to really move forward and progress. Whereas in this film, there's nothing that Francesco wants other than a love interest, but that's not really like a goal he actively pursues, at least not throughout the entire film. And the whole film is just sort of exploring that aspect of like a guy who doesn't really want anything, and he just kind of exists in his own strange reality. So I guess this would be a good point to ask, what did you actually make of the film's themes? What did you sort of think it's actually about yourself?
Yeah, so getting back to the idea of like existentialism, I think Dellamorte is someone who's looking for meaning in his shitty job with He shoots zombies for a living, and he's obviously pretty bored, and has kind of a pretty careless idea of like life and death. He's pretty nonchalant about it, and one kind of frustrating thing about me was he doesn't carry a gun on him at all times. He's like, he always has to tell Gnaghi to like, fetch me my gun. Dude, you shoot zombies. Why do you not have a gun on you at all times? So anyways, it's about him looking for meaning both through love, through his profession, I would say as well, and really not finding anything. Even like you could call his love life. I mean, to me, his love interest, the love exists on a very superficial level. It's not really anything that the film, I think, explores or shows deeply. It's really just he meets this beautiful woman, and then they basically kiss pretty quickly, and then they have sex on at the cemetery, and then she shortly dies. So, it's basically like, and that was maybe his a pretty rare, I guess, encounter for him, given this pretty isolated area where all he has is Gnaghi, this, his mentally disabled pal, who maybe, like, this is also some interpretation, but I think he might be keeping Gnaghi around maybe just for his own self-esteem, his own, like, this guy, at least I'm not like Gnaghi, who's really needs to depend on someone else to function and survive. But that even gets subverted at the very end. So anyways, so he's a guy who's just kind of chugging along without meaning. And then he gets kind of the idea at some point, why don't I just start killing actual people? Because that will be different. That'll, people will maybe start to recognize me, and maybe I'll get more of a meaning with my life. And even that gets taken away from him because no one even thinks it's him. At some point, someone else confesses to his crimes. So, that's kind of at least where I'm at with my interpretation of the film. There's still things that are really strange to me, like the whole, you could talk about his whole, trying to remove his genitals part, the most bizarre scene, I think, in the film for me. But yeah, I guess, how is my interpretation, I guess, aligned with yours or not aligned?
Mine, I'd say, is pretty similar. I guess I should start here. I think this is a film that's very difficult to interpret because I think part of the appeal of the film is that it doesn't have a definitive interpretation. Like, I think there are some films out there that are more like puzzles that you can piece together and work out what the grandiose meaning is and how all the pieces fit together and form this like grand picture. But this isn't really one of those films. Like, for me, the appeal of the film really is in its aesthetics. It's very aesthetically forward film where it has a very sort of definitive atmosphere that's very unique. It's very funny. It takes these really serious ideas of death and love and blends them together in a really, really funny way. Like, even as you mentioned, like the love interest, like he kind of woos her by taking her to an ossuary, and then they sleep together on her dead husband's grave, and then she dies immediately herself. So at all points in the film, like, love and death is really like intertwined and constantly works together. But if I really had to sort of put an interpretation together, then I think from that idea that the whole story is told through Francesco's point of view, I think this film is essentially just a sort of deep dive of depression that has resulted as of fear of death and desire for love without being able to obtain it. And I think Francesco is this very pessimistic character as well, whereas Gnaghi is like his almost like other half. Like, I almost feel like Gnaghi might just be an imaginary person, like he is just Francesco's other half in the film, because at the end of the film, they decide basically nothing that Francesco does in the film goes well, and at some point in the film, he decides to leave this place where he works and go to the outside world, and the two of them pass the tunnel, which is like a common metaphor for passing to the afterlife. And at the end of the tunnel, they find out that there is no outside world. Like, the road just ends. And when that happens, through one way or another, Gnaghi and Francesco seemingly swap places. And now Francesco cannot speak anymore, and Gnaghi is taking care of him and essentially takes him back. But what's interesting about that is that throughout the film, it's kind of emphasized that wherever Francesco is pessimistic, Gnaghi is quite optimistic. Like, I think an obvious one would be the weather, whereas Francesco is always really upset when it's a sunny day. Gnaghi's actually quite happy when it's sunny. So I think they're almost like two halves of the same person that are almost like vying for power. One, this like very nihilistic, depressed, and pessimistic one that has all these like character flaws, like being misogynistic, etc. And one who is more pure, more optimistic, more noble in Gnaghi. And I think at the end of the film, like, the negative side has been winning all this time, and he effectively gets to a point of sort of an ending point of depression where he wants to essentially leave life entirely and kill himself in a way by leaving this place. But as he does that, as they pass the tunnel, they swap sides, and effectively the positive side now takes over and kind of reels Francesco back in and takes him back and starts, maybe, I don't know, fixing things at the end of the film, hopefully. But like I said, it's difficult to know whether any of that is even intentional, because the film doesn't really give any sort of anything to go off of, that any sort of kind of theory or interpretation you have might be correct or not. So a lot of this is just kind of guesswork, but that's kind of how I saw the film myself.
Yeah, and I should also mention passing through a tunnel, as Hitchcock shows in North by Northwest, can also be a sexual innuendo. But yeah, you're usually right. It can refer to going to the other side. It's interesting that you think that they could be the same person, because I guess I don't really gravitate towards those theories. Just naturally, I always take characters as face value, even though there are plenty of films where, yes, even like Persona, like we mentioned, there's plenty of theories that they are in fact the same woman, just different aspects of the same woman. Lots of films like that deal with characters with fractured, I guess, identities that manifest themselves in different people. So
yeah,
I would have to rethink a lot of this film if that were true. I think for me, the way I interpreted that ending, which was, I'm still odd, the fact that Gnaghi can speak and that Dellamorte, I think he even says like nah, like they
fully swap places.
Yeah. So I think it kind of shows that he's gotten to the point of such lowness that now even Gnaghi is above him at this point. So I don't know if we've mentioned the fact that they try to escape this world, and it turns out they're in a snow globe.
Yeah.
I think that fits perfectly into the existential idea. Basically, this is a world where it's just love and death. That's all there is. Mostly death, I would say, but there's basically no escape. Even when you try to leave, you're basically trapped in this world and your identity in this world. And yeah, Dellamorte has really nowhere to go but down in terms of his own, I guess, esteem and identity, which it's a very pessimistic reading, I would say, but I'm honestly not 100% sure what else to make of it.
Yeah.
So
I think the one reason I also gravitated towards that interpretation, because it was sort of made a point of the fact that Francesco at the end of the film loses the gun, like his gun falls off the edge of the world, and when that happens, that's when him and Gnaghi effectively swap places. So I almost read that he's given up the hatred or the pessimism, and the gun is almost like a symbol of that, because he obviously used that to not only kill the dead but also kill some actual real people at one point in time in the film. So that's why I sort of gravitated to that, maybe reading. But like I said, this isn't really a film I turn to for the reading. Like, I think the most interesting ideas within are more loose. They don't necessarily come together in a satisfying way, but they're just given out there in like random quotes or just random things that happen in the film, and they kind of make you stop and think about them. But really, what I in particular love about the film is just the aesthetic. Like, it's a very, even though it's similar to a lot of things, it's a very one-of-a-kind aesthetic. Like, to think of maybe like a similar film, I'd maybe say something like Clue, but even Clue is quite different, where it has like maybe the atmosphere, but it's doesn't go quite that hard and make the entire film revolve around these two ideas of life and death, and in particular in such a funny way. Like, it has that comedy where the characters in the film are taking everything like seriously, and they always play it straight, but everything that happens like makes absolutely no sense. Like, it's so absurd and so ludicrous. Like I mentioned previously, like Francesco Dellamorte, just the fact he always reads a telephone book, or the fact that for some reason everyone calls him an engineer, and he keeps reiterating throughout the film that he's not an engineer. It's just never explained, like, why is everyone calling him an engineer? I guess he's just an engineer. And the various other things, like some of the quotes, like when Francesco wakes up and goes outside and notices that it's sunny, he says, "The weather's gone bad again." Yeah. There's a bunch of other ones. Like when they're driving past the tunnel, and Francesco says, "Past this tunnel is the rest of the world. What do you think the rest of the world looks like, Gnaghi? Can you imagine it? You're right. It's beyond imagination." Like, everything he just says with a completely straight face, but it's all like completely ludicrous and absurd. And that's kind of just the appeal of this film. Like, it's dealing with really like quite heavy subjects like depression, death, love, etc. But it's all just so insane, so bonkers and off the wall.
Yeah, my favorite quote that I wrote down here is, as he's talking about his job, I think with the guy who's running for mayor. I'm trying to remember the scene, but I remember the quote. He says, "This is the only job I could get, even with a degree in biology."
Yeah.
So, it goes to show how bad the job market was even back then.
Yeah. I think at some point later in the film, he actually says that he lied about having a degree in biology. Like when he's, I think when he's talking to the Anna Falchi character, at some point in time, he confesses that he made up the fact that he has a degree in biology. But yeah, I wrote down a couple of other quotes. Like at one point in time in the film, I don't even recall when exactly he says this, but he says, "I'd give my life to be dead." It's also just a really funny thing to say, and I remember one in particular as well. At some point in time, you realize that you know more dead people than living, which is in particular apt for him because he obviously spends every night shooting the zombies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's definitely, again, ties into the whole film's, at least, theme to me, where he's not connected to this world. He's really just connected to the other side of this world, the dead. And as a guy who's just in this isolated and now boring profession, he looks for meaning and still struggles to find it by killing normal people. If I had, I guess, just one criticism of the film, thematically at least, is I touched on it a little, but I don't find the love aspect very explored. And I get that it's maybe a little difficult within kind of a genre and tone like this as well.
Yeah.
But it definitely, to me, the idea of death and killing and existentialism definitely preside over the love that exists. I think even the most romantic part of this film is Gnaghi falling in love with Valentina and their little secret romance, where she's in a broken television, her head, which I kind of love. So yeah, it's pretty sweet until it abruptly ends. But but yeah, none of Dellamorte's attempted romances really are anything of substance, I would say. So yeah, I guess for a film where that's part of the title, I expected a bit more of an exploration of that. So, just something that I guess for me, I'd like to have explored a little bit more.
Yeah, I'd say the love in the film really almost takes the form of either eroticism, and not just eroticism between Francesco and his love interest, but there's also just quite a bit of like homoeroticism, in particular how they shoot Rupert Everett's body in certain scenes. But also there's just a lot of strange, almost necrophilia-esque love for death, where both characters, both Gnaghi and Francesco at some point in time fall in love with dead people as well, like actual zombies. Gnaghi with the head, and Francesco when his love interest comes back to life after she's killed. But yeah, I do agree that I think love isn't as present in the film, and I think like what the film almost more revolves around is the lack of actual real love in Francesco's life. It's all just like very, very fleeting romances that are very strange and brief for the most part.
Yep, I agree. So, anything else you wanted to discuss about this film that we haven't talked about?
Well, I think that's most of what I wanted to say, but I think before we move on, I did want to ask, because you kept this a secret, did you actually like the film? Particularly because you said you're not a fan of horror. So, what did you make of it? Did you enjoy your time watching?
So, I guess before I answer, I am not. I mean, this might sound blasphemous, but I'm not particularly huge on the films of his master Dario Argento. I do like Suspiria. It's very stylish and fun with a great score, but it's very, to me, still very superficial. I don't like the other Argentos I've seen, which include some films people love, like Deep Red and Umbra. Even the style in those films is not particularly appealing to me. So definitely, I like this film a lot. With that all said in mind, I do think I would like it a little more if I had a little bit more background in Italian horror, because I do expect it plays more with the tropes than I might give it credit for. And it came at a really unusual time in Italian horror history, as we mentioned. So I think seeing some of those 80s Italian zombie movies might enhance my appreciation for this even more. But I definitely agree that the style of this film and the themes, for me, were probably among the strongest I've seen in the genre. And that I don't think I've seen a ton of Italian horror. I've seen some Mario Bava films, but aside from that, nothing by Fulci or some of the other, giallo or Italian horror masters. So anyways, I enjoy this film a lot.
Nice. It's a great success for fans of films that I also like me. But yeah, just one more thing I wanted to mention as well, because I just remembered it while you were talking. You know how you mentioned that Francesco doesn't carry his gun around with him, and he constantly has to ask Gnaghi to throw him the gun? That's actually a reference to the comic book Dylan Dog, because that happens quite a lot in Dylan Dog, where Dylan doesn't have his gun around with him, and he has to ask his assistant to throw him the gun. But here's the interesting thing. You know how I mentioned how Dylan Dog is like very heavily rooted in movies? So the name of Dylan Dog's assistant is Groucho, and as it happens, he looks exactly like Groucho from the Marx Brothers, who are obviously famous from films like Duck Soup. So when the comic book was published in America, because obviously when it was written in Italy, nobody cared about copyright, but when it was published in America, they had to change how the character looked and redraw all the images and rename him as well, because they did not have the rights to call him Groucho.
Nice. You're selling me on this comic. I love the Marx Brothers. So I think that wraps up our discussion on this film, this strange, unwieldy, but really stylistically beguiling and interesting film.
Yeah, I think we can move on to the next segment, where yet again I've been in the lab, I've been hard at work, and I've prepared another secret segment. And this week I have gathered a group of directors, and I want you to try and guess what is these directors' highest ranked film on They Shoot Pictures, Don't They? For those who don't know, They Shoot Pictures, Don't They is effectively a list that combines all the different greatest films of all time lists, and it effectively combines all of them into this one mega list that has 1,000 highest ranked films of all time based on all the other rankings out there. So the first one I have is actually someone you like quite a bit. It's Michelangelo Antonioni. He has one film in the top 100. What do you think that film is?
Just before I answer, I'd like to say if I ever get put in a real life Jigsaw trap, I do feel like this is the one type of I guess game where I feel like I probably have the highest chance of escaping, because I've seen this list probably too many times, more than your average person. So.
Oh, okay. So wait. Then before you answer, so I have 7 directors here. How many do you think you're gonna get correctly out of the 7?
If there's a time to be confident, I'd probably with this quiz. So I'm gonna guess 7.
Ooh, okay. Okay, we'll see.
But we'll see. I'm guessing you'll have a curveball thrown my way. So Antonioni, I think this one is pretty easy. I think the one film of his that was his breakout and that has been, I think the critics think is his best movie and one of the best films of the Italian post-neorealism era is L'Avventura.
That's correct. It is L'Avventura. It's in 37th position. Actually, I could have even let you guess the position, see how close you would have gotten. But yeah, and Antonioni has 8 films in the top 1,000, which is quite a lot, actually. I think it's more than most of the people on my list. And yeah, L'Avventura is like quite considerably higher than all the other ones. Okay, the next person I have is Sidney Lumet.
I think this one's interesting. I think there's definitely there's 2 possibilities that I think about. I'm gonna go with the one people don't think about so much. So obviously there's 12 Angry Men, which is classic film. Yeah, one of the first 10 old movies people watch in their lifetimes, universally. And then there's the other film, which I think has gotten a bit of a surge maybe lately, but it's always been well liked, which is Dog Day Afternoon, the 70s heist classic with Al Pacino, John Cazale. I'm going to go with Dog Day Afternoon because I just think it operates on both the kind of fun heist element, but it also has interesting, I guess, there's an interesting queer aspect to the film as well that I think has helped it kind of recently. So I'm going to guess it's slightly higher than 12 Angry Men.
You're correct. I thought I'd get you with the 12 Angry Men curveball, but yeah, you're actually correct. Dog Day Afternoon is the highest. What position roughly do you think it's at?
I'm going to guess 130.
353. Quite a bit lower than I even expected. And 12 Angry Men is actually only 533. There is one other film, so Lumet has 3 films in total, and it's actually higher than 12 Angry Men as well. Do you know what that film is?
Is it Network?
It is Network, yeah. Network is at 469.
Okay.
Okay. Next person I have on my list is actually someone who has 3 films in the top 50, and they're all very close to one another. So maybe you'll trip up on that. It's Tarkovsky, our good friend who doesn't really like experimental films.
Oh boy. Okay. Yeah, this one's a little tricky. I'm gonna guess. Okay, I'll say the 3 films I think they are, and then I'll have to narrow it down. So I think those 3 films are Stalker, Andrei
Yeah.
Rublev, and Mirror.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, I know critics love those three movies, and they're all at kind of different. They're all different aspects of Tarkovsky's filmmaking. The tricky part is which one is the highest? This is the latest poll, right? You're taking from?
Yeah, the one
So,
that's currently online.
Okay. I'm gonna guess it's not Stalker. Although I mean I don't know. It's this one I might get wrong because I just know all three of them are really beloved. I just think the critics probably like Andrei Rublev or Mirror the most. Mirror's probably the least generally accessible, but a lot consider his greatest movie. Andrei Rublev is kind of has that critical esteem. It's this epic, long film, historical portrait of the artist Andrei Rublev and figure. So
I can reveal that you're
choice.
correct so far. Stalker is 47. The other two are higher. One is 27 and the other is 23. So right next to one another.
This is tough. Yeah. I'm gonna go with Andrei Rublev, but I don't feel great about it.
Unfortunately, you're incorrect. Mirror is higher.
Okay.
It's the
Yeah,
first-
I wonder if that's a recent thing. I do feel like I've seen Andrei Rublev quite high, but I do think Mirror has this kind of abstract quality that I think has continued to, be seen more as his greatest work, and a bit more universal than something like Andrei Rublev. So, oh well.
You did manage to accurately narrow it down to the three correct films as well, and even worked out that Stalker is not in the top 2, and Tarkovsky has 7 films total in the top 1,000. Okay, the next person I have is another good friend of ours, good friend of the show, Michael Haneke.
Michael Haneke. Okay, so it is probably between Cachet, Amour, and I don't think White Ribbon or Funny Games would be that high. I want to say it's probably those two.
Okay.
Is that correct so far?
I won't say anything on this one.
Oh boy, I think I'm wrong. Well, okay, I'll just go with my train of thought. Oh wait, I forgot about the piano teacher. This is harder than I thought.
I'll say for this one,
Okay.
it's not that close. Like about 100 or 200 places separate each one of his films.
I see. Well, that's kind of close when you get far down the list, I think. But
True.
yeah.
I guess I can say so. The second one is 150 behind the one that's in the front, and then the one behind that one is 300 behind. And all the other ones are
I
just
see.
kind of like at the bottom of the list.
I see. I'm gonna go with Cachet, I think.
And that's correct. It is Cachet.
Yes. Okay.
Do you want to take a guess at what position it's roughly at?
450.
Quite a bit higher, actually. 250.
250. Okay.
The second highest is White Ribbon at 382, and then the third highest is
Oh, okay.
Amour.
White Ribbon. Yeah, I thought about White Ribbon. I just, I guess I never saw it like as the very highest Hanukkah, but yeah, second makes sense, I think.
Yeah, and he has a total of 6 films on the list.
I
Okay,
love Hanukkah.
yeah. The next director I have is Tsai Ming Liang.
Okay, I think this one's pretty easy actually.
Okay.
I'm gonna just say and lock in Goodbye Dragon in. Final answer.
That's correct. Do you want to take a shot at where it's at on the list?
Oh, I'm bad at the actual ranking. Let's see. 537.
Quite a lot higher again, 284.
Yeah.
Yes, two other films on the list, with L'Amour and The River, but they're both at the bottom of the list.
I see. Yeah, I guess I'm just maybe more used to the older lists where the more recent films are probably ranked lower. So I'm guessing they've just risen in the last few or so lists. So yeah, those are quite high placements. Not that I disagree, but they're it's interesting. Anyways.
Okay. The next director, going back to America, it's another person who has a few films that are decently close to one another. 3 films in the top 100. It's Billy Wilder.
Oh, okay. Well, I think this has to be. Well, it's probably of these two, but I think I know which one.
Okay.
I think it has to be between Sunset Boulevard and The Apartment, which, I mean, you could throw in like Some Like It Hot or Double Indemnity, which are also classics. All 4 of those films are like the big Billy Wilder 4. I just think The Apartment has kind of a universal appreciation and admiration. It's this really well done romantic drama. And then Sunset Boulevard has this whole like self-commentary on Hollywood going for it. Even though it exists within this noir genre. So I think it's The Apartment.
I'll say this one really surprised me as well. Because if you had asked me this question, I would have probably guessed Sunset Boulevard or maybe The Apartment. But it's actually Some Like It Hot.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to guess what position it's in?
Oh, it's probably really high. It's probably like...
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. 42.
32, even higher.
32, okay.
Yeah, this one really took me by surprise.
Yeah,
I didn't expect that at all. Sunset Boulevard was 46 and The Apartment was 59.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Interesting.
Okay. Last name is a bit of a curveball because I'll want you to name not his highest film, but actually his second highest film, because that person is Akira Kurosawa, and obviously his highest film is Seven Samurai because it's in the top 10. So I assumed you would probably guess that correctly. But I'm wondering, do you know what his second highest is?
Okay, so his second highest, I would think, without locking in yet, would be Rashomon. Trying to think of other candidates. It would probably be one of his 50s or 60s works. I don't think Ran is considered the second greatest Kurosawa in the eyes of a lot of critics. I think critics do like Rashomon a lot. Throne of Blood they like, but not that much. Jimbo, not as much, I don't think. And then there's those like 2 non-samurai films, Kiru and High and Low. My favorite is Akiru. And if the critics were epic, they would have Akiru pretty high up. I'm gonna guess it's Rashomon just because that has a lot of historical importance, and I think is still very influential. I don't particularly love Rashomon, but I get its importance, so I'm gonna guess Rashomon.
And you'd be correct. It is Rashomon. It's ranked 24th. I had a quick bonus round as well, because I thought this one would be too easy as well. So because we were talking about Cemetery Man and Italian horror, I thought I'd include one of the Italian horror greats and ask if you could name what's the highest one for Dario Argento. He has 2 films on the list. I'm wondering if could you try and name both of those films? Not necessarily guess which one is higher.
Right. I think Suspiria has to be the highest.
Yep, that's correct.
As for the second one, that's interesting. I would guess Deep Red. He made other films people really like after Suspiria and after Deep Red, which were like Tenebrae, Phenomena. Those I think are a little more horror I don't think they have as broad appreciation. I think they're more of a within horror circles, more and more. Even though I do think they're well liked. I'm gonna guess it's Deep Red. I don't really see other candidates.
And you'd be correct. It is Deep Red. Pretty good overall. Only got 2 wrong out of the 7. It was Wilder and Tarkovsky that tripped you off. Both of them were quite tricky because they had 3 films in the top 100, so they were all quite close together.
Yeah, those were trickier than I was expecting. I'd be curious how Some Like It Hot, if that were always in like the top 40, or if it just climbed more and more recently. That's interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah.
So, fun game.
I think it probably would have survived the Jigsaw's trap with what would it be 6 out of 8.
Well, if I had to go perfect, like my hubris, made me predict at the beginning, maybe I'd still get killed. We'll see.
Yeah, probably, or at least end up a bit injured. Maybe lose an arm or something.
Maybe like a limb for each wrong guess.
Yeah.
All right. So why don't we move into our closing segment where we give recommendations for this episode? So could you buy me a little bit of time to think about what I'm supposed to be recommending and go first?
Okay. So I've actually gone for a song this week. I haven't watched that many movies last week, haven't finished any books. So I've instead gone for a song I've been listening to lately. It's by a band called Witch, which is actually a Zamrock band from Africa, obviously. And it's a song called Avalanche of Love. It's a really, I should say it's a rock song. I really like how like strange it sounds. It's just a really exciting, groovy song. And I've been listening to it quite a bit the past week, so I thought I might as well recommend it here.
Yeah, so I will also go for a piece of music, just to throw a little curveball at everyone again. We'll pick this piece called Black Angels by the composer George Crumb. This is a very interesting piece. It sounds like no other classical music. I'm sure people who've only heard like, I don't know, Mozart, Beethoven, whatever. This, from the very first notes of this piece, it starts with this incredibly high shrieking, piercing violin, very scary. It's a piece I've heard and I've known about for a long time, but I had the good fortune to actually hear it with the Kronos Quartet playing in concert a week ago. They were actually playing, accompanying a documentary of themselves. The documentary was called A Thousand Thoughts, which was interesting too. A bit conventional, but it was really uniquely presented, where the subjects themselves were present and accompanying it while it unfolded. So it was unique. But Black Angels was one of the pieces, and that just brought me way back to, I guess, more of my like teenage years when I heard that piece for the first time, and my mind kind of melted. So yeah, would highly recommend just checking it out. Maybe don't put it on super loud for your neighbors, but definitely a good time.
Sounds good.
I think we can call that an episode and sign off from here. So again, my name's been Daniel.
And I've been Linus. Remember to give the podcast a rating if you've enjoyed, and share it with your friends. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.